and Jupiter really loves it. Mars, Pluto in the 11th. Perhaps I should mention that too. Okay, now what I want to do today, what I plan to do, whether this is what happens or not, I don't know, but what I'd like to do is to talk to you a little bit about the cycles of all the different planets. Now, most of us, especially the women, and I hope the men will forgive me for projecting this onto the woman, but I am a woman and I know this part of it. When we have our children, you can buy plenty of books which tell you all about the various stages of the child's life. You know, at 2, they're going to go through the teething stage, or a bit earlier than that, hopefully. They're going to go through this stage at 5, this stage at 10, and we all know the stages of the 15-year-old, and so on. But they all cut off about 18, and they presume that by the time you're 18, you've got it all together. There's no more stages to go through. This is rubbish. We go through stages from birth to death. And these stages can be very, very easily seen without the birth chart, just by knowing how old a person is. The same with a child. By knowing how old a person is, we know what stage of life they're at. We know the basic problems that person is going to face at that time. But you can also use this cyclic pattern within the chart. Now I'm getting hot. Hot and cold to go on and off in a day. Most astrologers use the system of progressions of some sort or other. Each astrologer has their favourite method of progression, but they tend to use progressions to see where their client or the person they're doing the chart for, where that person is at in terms of growth and so on. And very many of them, too many of them, including me, tend to ignore too much the cyclic patterns of the planets in the chart itself, and I'd like to try and cover both of these if I can. Now, also I find that personally it's a great comfort to know what stage I'm at, to know that I'm sharing this, I'm 41 years old, and I'm sharing problems which are common to nearly all women between 38 and 45. I happen to be sharing the biggest one of a lot. That's a very important age, which I'll come to later. Now, I find that I'd say 60% of my clients come to me when they're about 29 or about 40 or about 56, which of course are the 3 major stages. There are others, but those 3 are the big ones, the heavies. And it's quite often, I find it quite funny, we fight very hard to put down this clairvoyant trip, fortune teller trip and all this sort of thing. But so often a client, someone will ring me up for the first time and they'll say, oh, Chris, I'm having all this terrible problem, this, that and the other. And I say, are you 29? Yes, how did you know that? That's terrific, And it really makes me chuckle because they've immediately put me there, oh, she must be clairvoyant because she knows I'm 29. It's not at all. They're describing the classic Saturn return symptoms. And it's very easy to do once you get it firmly into your mind. Now, there are a few other little cycles. I mean, we all know the Saturn return. Most of us know about the Uranus opposition. But there are a couple of other ones. Brian mentioned this morning the Jupiter return and the Mars return. Every planet has a return, and these are important. But there's another little one which is never used, and I love it. It's a little fun one. And I first heard about this from Edith Custer when she was lecturing in Sydney a few years ago. Now, I don't know whether she's lectured. Has she ever lectured here in New Zealand? Well, she's great. I mean, the humour of that lady is marvellous. And this is the one she gave me. I've put to work, and those of you that are interested in numerology will like it too, because it's relating the signs to the number of the years where you're at. In other words, anything with a number 1 is an Aries cycle. So your first year of birth, your 25th year of birth, your 37th year, and 25th year of birth doesn't quite make sense. Do you know what I mean? When you're 25, when you're 37, when you're 49, and so on. These are 1 year. And those years will always have an Aries connotation. You'll always be starting something then. They're the years that, right, I'm going to go out and get the world and grab it by the tail and do something with it. In the same way that all the 2 years will have a Taurus combination. 2-year-old baby's got his teddy bear clutched. Right? 3-year-old baby, the Gemini year, that's when they start talking. I mean, I don't mean learning to talk, I mean yabba, 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 yabba. Okay? And this applies right through life. In the same way, the first year of the first day of something, the first month of something will have these same. Second day, second month will have the Taurus connotation. So apply that to the little things. It's a little fun thing. I mean, it's not a heavy, serious thing. It's a little fun thing. You see, it does work. Whenever you have the Taurus combination, that's when you're gathering any resources. You're pulling them all into you. You're a little calmer than you were the year before, or the day before, or the month before, and so on right through. I don't want to go right through all of them. But where you can work this very well is if you combine, or you start it, by the way, the month, you start from your birthday. So if your birthday is in July, like mine, then the Aries month is August, right? And the Taurus month is September, and so on. And if you combine that with the year, okay, I've got an example here rather than make you have to think about it. 27th year is a Scorpio. What have I got? 27th year Scorpio. I make tremendous notes. They're terrific when I write them. They make no sense at all when I try to read them back. Yes, so if you're a Scorpio and you're 27, that is a Gemini year, and of course the month of your birthday is an Aries month. Right, so you combine that, the Gemini year with the Aries month, with the fact that you are a Scorpio. So perhaps when you're 27, if you're a Scorpio, you'll be a little bit more communicative than you usually are. I should meet all my Scorpios when they're 27. And with the Aries month, again, that tremendous Scorpio energy, which is normally so controlled and so contained, perhaps at that time they're a little bit more expansive, a little bit more outgoing. Okay? Oh, please, any questions? I work very well on feedback. Great.
Well, how do you get on when you've got, say, 10 planets and 12 signs?
No, you're working on the signs. This has got nothing to do with the planets. This is the signs. Okay? Any others here? All right. Okay, I'll bring it back to me. Let's calculate this out. It's now January. Yes, January. I was 41 last July. Okay, so 41, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41. So that's a fifth year, which is a Leo year. Right? Hang on. Yes, Leo year. 41 is a Leo year for me. For everybody. January, August, September, no, July, wasn't it? July, August, September, October, November, December, January. That's the 7th month. So we'll be coming back to February. Right? So I'm in a Leo year with a Libra month. And it is working that way because what am I doing? 2 conferences in a row. And as soon as I finish those 2 conferences, I will be doing some more smaller seminars straight after. And I'm planning with the Leo year, what I'm planning for the year is to do a lot of weekend type workshops instead of my normal school teaching classes. Right? Oh, I think that's my cancer son anyway.
Yeah. And the writing book, that's often seen in a Leo thing.
The writing of the book is a entirely different thing. My progress Jupiter came to conjunct my sun this year. So bang. And I got my computer with its word processor. The book got written.
You basically had the month next to your birth month and
Did I do that? No, the first month obviously. Oh, I did that, did I? Girl. July must have been the first one. Not in a Libra one, am I? Now what I did, I'll tell you what I did. Yes, you take the month of your birthday as the first one. Let's clarify. The month of your birth is the first one, so July would be the first one for me, obviously. I think I did that, but I did it the other way around with the years. I can never remember what I go too fast. This is Mercury in Gemini in the 9th house is a menace. Because my mind is over there.
your system of numerology, would it count as two things or no?
Well, I don't know very much about numerology. I know that
signs as well.
Yeah, you can play with it. Look, this is just a bit of a fun thing. So play with it, see what you can come up with it yourself.
But you work on the zodiacal unit, so we take that if I'm 37, which I'm not, I'm a bit...
Now that's Freudian. What happened at 37?
Yeah. But anyhow, that's an Aries year, 37, for anybody.
Yes. Right. For everybody, and I mean, this is one where we're in an out-of-chart cycle.
Yeah.
You know, I call them out-of-chart and in-chart. So that everybody who is 37 is going through an Aries year. So you can expect that kind of colouring. on the... I look at astrology, I look at a chart as a system. Have you ever watched a cartoonist drawing cartoons? And he draws one drawing on a transparency, then he puts another transparency on, and he draws something on that, puts them together, and so on, and he gets layers and layers and layers of transparency. Well, I look at a chart like that, in that you get all these added things, like these little things that we're talking about here, as what I call layers of glad rags over the top. You're putting extra colouring over, an extra layer of something. And this is that sort of thing. That it doesn't matter what you are, at 37 you'll have that little bit of Aries colouring on top of everything else. Right, and so on, all the way through. All right, now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Oh, I should have said too, those of you who are fairly advanced with astrology, you're not going to learn anything new today. I'm going right down to basics. I don't want to go into the advanced stuff, so all your beginners will be very happy because there'll be nothing you can't understand, I hope. Now, the sun cycle. The sun cycle is almost too obvious. It's so obvious you miss it. The sun goes through all 12 signs of the zodiac in a year, but more importantly, in chart, it goes through every house in the course of 12 months. And too many of us tend to miss where is the transiting sun this month. Now, all of us, I think, have been through the experience of saying, oh, October's an awful time for me, I hate October, everything goes wrong in October. Or, if you're like me, you get all the big bills in the 1 month. The whole lot, car registration, house insurance, the lot. I get all that when my sun is going through my 6th house, transiting sun. I'm talking about transits here at the moment. Watch the house that the transiting sun is going through, and it will show you the focus of your life at that time. Also, those times when the sun is in square to itself. For instance, me being a Cancer, October is a rotten month as the sun goes through Libra and squares my sun. Right? That's when I have my heavy time. Also, not to quite the same extent, but also around March, April, which is the Aries time. Christmas time, the opposition, no. Doesn't, to my mind anyway, it doesn't affect me personally. The two squares do. They affect quite strongly. Look at this in relationship to those months that you don't like. Now, the sun has another very, very important cycle, which draws in all the other planets as well. At age 30, 45, 60 and 90, you should live so long. The sun forms an aspect to itself by progression. At 30, it is semi-sextiling itself. And it doesn't matter whether you use secondary directions or solar arc. I use both, by the way. I'm still trying to make up my mind. At 45, it's semi-squaring itself, and at 60, it is sextiling itself, and at 90, it is squaring itself. Now, this becomes very important because by solar arc, if the sun is making an aspect to itself, so is every other planet making an aspect to itself. Because when you add the solar arc on, you are bringing everything to the proportion of the sun to the sun. So you have the sun aspecting itself, the moon, if you use solar arc progressions right through, you have the moon aspecting itself, Mercury aspecting itself, Venus aspecting itself, etc., etc., etc. In other words, you have the whole natal chart triggered. Not just by one planet, but by all planets. And that is why these ages are very important, and they're going to come up time and time again. And I'll go into them further as we go through. The moon cycle is I find the moon cycle very interesting. There is the theory that anybody who has a strong moon in their chart, Cancer sun, Cancer moon, Cancer rising, moon conjunct sun, all those sort of things, that the full moon and the new moon affects them. I always laughed ridiculous actually, but until the day of my divorce, I got divorced on a full moon. This is a story, it has nothing to do with the lecture, I just thought I'd tell you. And my students had said to me once that they noticed a difference in me. They noticed that I get very high on a full moon, and I thought I was just making that up, you know. And of course, divorce for Cancer Taurus, you can imagine the trauma that is expected for a Cancer Taurus to go through divorce. I don't know whether wrong with the divorce, and I don't know what they're like here, but it's production line over there. And I had to wait, we had to sit and wait for about 3 hours. And I had a class that night, and I went in, my whole family, I got home, my whole family, are you all right? Are you okay? Is there anything we can do? And the class came in expecting to have the weepy teacher there, you know, who wasn't going to be concentrating at all. I was as high as a kite. I had a ball. I had a wonderful time. And then I realised that, yes, that full moon does affect me. Are there any other strong moon people here who find that? You find it? But I found that it doesn't affect each moon person the same way. I get high. Other people get very depressed. You know? Thank goodness I get high. I think I'd rather do that than get depressed. With moon conjunct Saturn, I do enough of that anyway. Now the main thing, to come back to the lecture, the main object, I suppose, if you want to call it that way, of the moon cycle, or the main manifestation of the moon cycle, I feel, is to influence your day-to-day life. It's only a 2.5 day cycle. Right? Every 2.5 days it changes sign, which means that every month it goes through every house in your chart and every sign in the chart. And I feel that if you watch the transit of the moon through the signs, a lot of us tend to ignore it, or us Geminians tend to ignore it because it's too quick and we can't be bothered. It doesn't have any very profound effect. But it does very strongly influence you, particularly if you're a very watery person or a very mutable person. You'll find that it's the moon that is affecting your rotten days and your good days. Now, you ever have those days where it doesn't matter what you do, everything seems to go wrong, or it doesn't matter what you do, everything goes right. And I think you'll find there is a direct connection to where the moon is in your chart.
The first that you want to elaborate on that is when the transit of the moon is in the same sign as your natal month, because if you watch it, you'll see your more negative qualities coming out.
Oh, interesting. I haven't looked at that. I'll do that. So, what you're saying is that when the transiting moon is in the same sign as your natal moon, you'll see your more negative lunar qualities, or just your general...
Just in general, so if you want to observe yourself or somebody else, it's quite a good time.
I'm going to use that when I get home. Right, no, that's a good one, thank you. There's another interesting little one about the moon cycle, again, which is not quite to do with this, that I've noticed, and I think it'd be fun to look at here too. I've noticed that when there is a full moon, it affects the situation, the mundane situation that is governed by the moon in that sign in the country. For example, I don't know, when's tax time in the States? When does your financial year end? In April. Well, ours ends in June.
But I'm Canadian.
Canadian, well, I'm sorry.
But it's not the same.
Yeah, yeah. Well, ours ends in June, which is when the full moon is in Capricorn, which I always think is rather funny. It's very typical, the end of the financial year. And I noticed this. How this came up to me was one year we had at home, when the moon was in Scorpio, we had a very, very big prison rebellion. And straight following that, when the full moon was in Sagittarius, we had a printer strike. I thought, oh, look at that! Isn't that interesting? And I followed it. It doesn't always work. I mean, not every time the full moon is in Sagittarius you get a printer strike. But you'll find that there is a national focus on some area which is governed by that sign. It's a very interesting one to watch, that one. Something I'd like to, for the women to have a look at. This is something which sounds like a silly thing, but I think it could be some very valuable research, believe it or not. I'd like those women with daughters to have a look at the moon transits when their daughters start menstruating. Or if you can remember the date when you started menstruating, was the moon doing anything interesting then? Because in theory, of course, the moon is directly involved with the menstrual cycle. And I think, I mean, it sounds like a funny thing to look at, but a lot of, if you can see when your child, or when we know when somebody is going to start menstruating, it can actually be quite valuable in a psychological way, because even in this day and age, there are still a lot of young girls or future women who are affected by the psychological impact of lack of education, or even sometimes when you've had full education, the menstrual cycle is a very big change, and it can have quite a strong effect. And if we can find what it is in the chart that correlates with that onset of the menstrual cycle, I believe it can be a very useful tool. Incidentally, I believe that nothing in the chart makes you do anything. I think I go against a lot of astrologers who talk about the energies of this doing this and so on and so forth. I think the energies are there, but I don't think they make you do anything. I think the chart is a mirror. It shows what you are doing. It shows how you are likely to manifest. So I know I say it makes you do, but I don't mean that. I feel that it shows. So that's a good one. I also feel in the same way that the moon will also probably trigger menopause, but of course menopause is a much longer effect. It's not something that happens as quickly as menstruation does. But there's another thing here with that, in that the menstrual cycle from go to woe, we tend to say, okay, a girl starts her period, she started menstruating, she's grown up and so on and so forth. In actual fact, medically that's not so. A girl can menstruate for 3 or 4 years before she starts to ovulate. It also can be quite a long period. That's a very bad pun. Anyway, I think that's worth watching, having a look at. I think, these little areas, because I feel now we are at the state where we can at long last start to really research astrology, and the areas of research are wide open. There are hundreds of them. And this is one of those funny little areas which nobody ever thinks about. Talk about Cancer Moon, my God. That's one of those little areas where nobody ever thinks of, but I think there could be quite a lot of value. Now the mystique has been removed from that whole thing, let's astrologers be amongst the first to sort of do something concrete with it. The moon takes about 2 days to go through the signs and houses, not much more than that. Now, the major cycle of the moon, of course, is the progressed cycle, or what's called the lunar return. And that occurs around 28, which is the conjunction. Around 42, you get the opposition, progress moon, opposition, natal moon. Around 56, you get the second lunar return. Around 70, you get the second lunar opposition. And around 84, you get the next conjunction. Those ages are already starting to sound a little familiar. Now these again signify full change. I'm going through each planet at the moment. I'm going to tie them all in together when we've gone through each one. So if I'm not putting much interpretation on it, that's why. I want to go through, give you the overall picture first. All right, then we come to Mercury and Venus, and I'm hoping you're going to help me here in some of your observations, because I haven't been able to follow Mercury-Venus cycles very clearly. They don't seem to have very clear cycles. The only thing I can see is, one of the questions I'm always asked by laymen is, what's the connection between astrology and biorhythms? Well, the emotional biorhythm is obvious, that's the moon cycle. As near as I can see it, the intellectual cycle seems to correlate in with the Mercury cycle, and the physical seems to correlate vaguely with the Mars cycle. But apart from that, Mercury and Venus don't seem to have a specific, nothing we can sort of pin down and say that's it there. But if any of you have other experience, please tell us. Obviously, again, sorry, someone wants to say something? No?
Would you mind just saying again that the moon was the emotional cycle?
The moon seems to correlate with the emotional cycle. It's a 28-day cycle.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the moon. That's obvious.
Yeah.
Mercury correlates with the intellectual cycle, but not as clearly. I can't remember. Is anybody into biorhythms? Can they tell me what the actual time is? 31, yeah, I can't remember. It's a long time since I've really looked at it. Well, to me, there's that when the little bit of work that I've done on it, and I had a scientist friend once who I gave a yearly progressions to, to spite him really. I said, here, take these, do with them what you want. And what he did was tie them into his biorhythms in the computer, and he found that worked very, very strongly. They tied in very strongly progressions with his biorhythms. And we sort of sat down and worked this out, that it seems to be the Mercury cycle and the Mars cycle that correlate with the intellectual cycle and the physical cycle, which makes sense, because Mars, of course, represents everything physical, and Mercury represents the intellectual. I don't want to get into a philosophical argument about Jupiter and Uranus and all that sort of thing there, but you know what I mean.
There's one other thing about biorhythm, and that is that when your moon is in your opposite your moon in your natal chart, it's your high day, and when it's in your opposite, it's your low day. So
when the moon is in the same, when the moon is conjunct.
When the moon's conjunct your natal moon, it's your high day, and when it's on exactly the opposite side of your chart, the sign that's opposite your moon, it's your low day.
Actually, that conflicts a little bit with what you were saying, doesn't it? I need reading glasses. I can't read everybody's name. Alan and Nathan, right. Alan was saying before that when the moon is in its own sign by transit, then you are aware of the negativity of yourself and of others. Now you're saying in actual fact that it's a high day.
Yes, yes, it contradicts it.
Yeah, and when the moon is in the opposite sign to its own sign, that's a low day. There you are, there's something for you all to go out and have a look at and see which one works. I love that, that's great. I love getting that sort of conflict. Not conflict, it's just two different ideas. Now, I think Mercury and Venus, the best thing to do with them in a cyclic way is to basically just watch their transit through your chart. It's an in-chart cycle rather than out-of-chart cycle. To watch the Mercury, because they're so close to the Sun, they take roughly a year to go right round the chart, depending on retrogradation, etc. It might take a little bit less or a little bit more. But the Mercury going through your houses, you'll find that the focus of life represented by that house, that time will be a very busy time, a very fussy time. There'll be sort of a lot of little details going on that are totally unimportant that you've got to deal with. I'll take that off, that bangs on the different. When Venus goes through, it's not quite so noticeable except as a calming effect. That's when you feel it eases situations, it makes things pleasant. You might go to parties or movies or something like that, but basically it just makes you feel, what the hell? Venus is ease. Venus loves to take the easy way out. And Venus is brilliant at shrugging its shoulders. I always have a vision of Venus like that. Because they'd rather just let it go. You know, let it go, it'll take care of itself. I don't want to be bothered. And that's all I really noticed with Mercury and Venus. Has anybody got anything to offer there? What they think with Mercury and Venus? Or they noticed anything?
Yes, it's quite often when Mercury is coming around, something has happened, but it hasn't come to mind.
That's interesting.
You become aware of it.
So it's suddenly, by coming around to that point, it's suddenly put into the conscious mind. Yeah, yeah. Well, this ties in, I mean, again, I think we ought to perhaps mention here the good old retrograde Mercury, how when Mercury goes retrograde, this is something I'd never followed, but everybody always tells me, they never hesitate to tell me that, oh, look, Mercury's retrograde at the moment, so don't do this, don't do that, so I never bother even looking at it. But inevitably there are, and again, this seems to hit certain people more than others. There are some people who, without a doubt, when Mercury turns retrograde, their phone is going to go out of order. Without any doubt whatsoever. Again, there are other people who it doesn't seem to affect them. It doesn't affect me very much. I don't find that retrograde Mercury affects me terribly much at all.
It does most things, particularly with retrograde business.
It does. I could imagine it would. But that is a cycle, again, that a lot of people sort of keep an eye on, to watch when Mercury is retrograding. Now, again, we're talking about transits. And retrograde Mercury is supposed to hinder communications, to stop things from actually happening. And they always say never start something like writing a book or whatever under a retrograde Mercury, because you're not going to get going until it turns direct again. As I say, I don't find that works for me. You may find it works for you. And it's interesting because Mercury is such a strong planet in my chart. It's final dispositor in its own sign. And it's a very strong planet, and yet it doesn't seem to... Mind you, it's a direct planet, so that maybe that has something to do with it.
So have you ever travelled in the day?
No, I haven't.
I have.
Unless it's retrograde at the moment.
Plane went on was late.
Yeah. Well, this is the sort of thing that happens with Mercury retrograde. Planes are late, trains are late, it rains, you break down, you know, the phone goes out of order, the letter you've been waiting for, you know, all these sorts of things. It's a general communications breakdown. It's that simple.
Does that mean if you have a retrograde Mercury at birth that you're possibly delayed in coming out?
I've heard that. No, quite seriously. I have heard the theory that if you have a retrograde Mercury at birth, you don't actually come to your full depth until it actually turns direct by progression. But most of the retrograde Mercuries I know object to that violence. Perhaps the case of what you were talking about, the denial.
Most of some of the most wittiest people are Mercury.
Yes, that I yeah,
Smile.
that's right. I'm still very much, and we're regressing totally, but I'm still very, because retrogradation is a whole lecture, series of lectures, workshops in itself. And I'm very, very much still making up my mind about retrogrades. I have none. And this is something that's very important, I think, for everybody. You can only ever come from where you're at and your terms of experience. And it's always a bit of a mystery to me when people start talking about, oh, when it goes retrograde, this happens and that happens. I think, oh, that's interesting, that's nice, you know. In the same way, I don't have any oppositions, and I haven't got a clue how an opposition works from an experiential point of view. Not the faintest idea. And I listen to all the conflict going on from the people that do. Conjunctions, now there I'm an expert. Mars takes 2 years to go through the zodiac, twice the time as the Sun, roughly. And it forms a major hard aspect every 6 months. Now I've tried to watch this when I think of it, and there is no doubt of it that when you are on one of those days, or it usually takes about 2 days to go through, where you've got the Mars forming a conjunction, square or opposition to itself, it's not usually a good day. Good day to stay in bed. And you'll often find that something you start under a Mars conjunct itself, you will be doing, or that project will remain active until the opposition or the following conjunction. Nearly all these cycles work from conjunction to opposition or conjunction to conjunction, but the conjunction to opposition is one cycle within the cycle of the conjunction to the conjunction. I might just draw that up for you, actually. Don't we have any dusters?
There's a rag somewhere.
So, with all these cycles, all the ones I've been talking about and all the ones I will talk about, is really a series of cycles within cycles within cycles within cycles within cycles. And that's where it becomes difficult, sorting out which is the cycle within the cycle and which is the beginning of a completely new cycle. So you have a conjunction, which for the sake of these I'll put at the top. You have a square on either side, and you have the opposition. I don't know why it is that way, it should be round. So you have the cycle from conjunction to conjunction. Right, that's the full cycle. Then you have the cycle from the conjunction to the opposition. Then, inevitably within that, and this is not a real cycle, you have, except when you get to the outer plane, you have the cycle which is the conjunction to the square. Square to the opposition, and square back to the conjunction. Now, these I find are not real cycles. These are the real cycle within cycle within cycle. These can be full cycles. It's very often hard to separate. Usually what happens is if you don't complete the cycle from conjunction to opposition or opposition to conjunction, you will then complete it on the full 360-degree circle. But the squares are usually testing points. You very rarely complete or start a cycle at that point. You shift it. You shift the focus of it. But if you're working through these cycles and you get to the opposition, or if you're going from the opposition to the conjunction and you don't complete it, you then have to work your way right round till it comes back to the starting point. Okay? So with Mars, you will get that situation that if you start something under this conjunction, it will last probably until you get down to the opposition. And then you start something new and you go back up to the conjunction. And it is interesting, once I sort of researched this or looked at this, I started to look at how many things do last about 6 months. 6 months seems to be a very common period for doing things. And the 12 months for the full thing, 2 years to get right around the whole bizzo. Now the effect of Mars is reactive and energising, I've got here. Mars is the physical energies, it's the outward energies. It's the way we react, or it is the reaction. It's not so much the way we react, but the reaction that we have to situations. So it is often physical. I always think that Mars is perhaps the easiest planet to see actually working because it's nearly always out there. I'm not talking about the psychological side, the deep side of Mars. I'm talking about the everyday use of Mars. It takes about 2 months to go through a sign and house. So again, watch this very carefully, because that time, that house of your chart that Mars is going through will be a house that is really activated, and I mean activated literally. It'll be a very active period in that area. For instance, Mars going through the 4th house is the time when you decide to do all the painting and the wallpapering. Been planning it for 6 months from the square before, but you don't do it till it gets down to that 4th house. You probably plan it in the 1st house and do it when it gets to the 4th house. Now, from Mars we come to the outer planets. Poor old Jupiter and Saturn don't really get classified as anything, do they? They're not inner planets and not outer planets, they're right in the middle. I call them the bridge, they're the bridge. But it's very interesting, when you do secondary direction progressions, it's the Sun to Saturn you normally look at closely, and when you do transits, it's Jupiter to Pluto that you look at closely, and that Jupiter-Saturn seems to act as a bridge between the two. So we come to Jupiter, which the purpose of what we're talking about here, I'm going to classify as an outer planet because it already starts the long cycle. It has a 12-year cycle. It takes 12 years to go through the zodiac, which means that every 6 years it forms a conjunction or an opposition to itself. And it means that at age 12, 24, 36, all your Pisces years is a Jupiter year. Right? Jupiter conjunction. Jupiter comes round to conjunct itself. Makes sense. Jupiter is a co-ruler of Pisces. At age 30 and 42, it forms an opposition to itself. At age 30 and 42. 30. Jupiter is experience, expansion, growth. So every 12-year period marks an important period of experience, of expansion, of growth. Okay, and again we've got these age tying in again. Now, this means that in theory you have virtually a 12-year expansion, and I found in my experience that often what happens is that you get onto not quite a philosophy, that's not the word I'm looking for, but for instance, let's say you get religion, right? That religion will often last for about 12 years, and in the 12-year period, you suddenly decide, oh, that's not really what I want, I'll go on to something else. And you go on to something else, and the effects of those philosophies will tend to last for that 12-year period. I mean, it might peter out and it might change slightly in that, but it's basically that 12-year period that you tend to live a philosophy for that length of time. Now, when we start getting to these outer planets, we start to form a more interesting in-chart cycle as well, and that is the outer planets to the other planets. In other words, we're starting to form cycles not only with themselves. We not only have Jupiter conjuncting itself every 12 years, but we have it conjuncting every other planet every 12 years too. And we start to get this now with all these planets. Now that in itself forms a cycle. In other words, when transiting Jupiter comes up to conjunct your Sun, it will start a cycle to do with the Sun. Let's pick a slightly easy one. Let's say Jupiter coming to conjunct Saturn. Okay? That will start a cycle probably to do with a business sort of thing, with you making your mark in the material world. And that will be the start of a 12-year cycle or a 6-year cycle with the opposition. So that what you start at that point will come to completion in 6 years' time at the opposition, or in 12 years' time at the opposition, at the conjunction. Conjunctions, opposition. Okay? Now, this is good when you watch this, because when you're working with people and you see these conjunctions coming up, you can start to talk to them, all right, what was going on 6 years ago? What did you start 12 years ago? And you may find that this is the basis of what's going on with them at the moment, that they're trying to work through or trying to tie this particular problem up in some way, finishing it. Jupiter goes through the houses in a year, thank God. Just gone through my seconds. So no, that's my third. I skipped that, so I'm a year behind myself. So in that year, that focus of life represented by that house is a time when you can really expand. It's a time when you can really do things with the areas of life represented by that house. Obviously, going through the second, that's a time when you can lay good material foundations. You can really get your resources together and collect them together and do something with it. Again, you were talking about me writing my book before. That was done while Jupiter was going through my third. And it was a very third house thing. It wasn't a ninth house thing, it was a third house thing. Because it's stuff I've been teaching for years, and I didn't have to make it all up, I just wrote it. It was all there. Jupiter going through the seventh, I think, is a delightful time for really working at that relationship. And I don't mean working in the sense that we usually regard work. I mean being able to expand where the relationship is, being able to experience the relationship for what it is rather than for what you want it to be. Because to me, this is what Jupiter is. Jupiter, and I guess this is because I'm Jupiter ruled, Jupiter is experience. It's getting in there and living it. And in the living it, learning about it and growing from it. It's not just the reading about it and putting it all in there. It's an experiential planet. A lot of people don't see it that way, but I find it works very well that way if you let it. You've got to let it. There are with Jupiter, of course, as with all the planets, but I think with these outer ones you've got to start looking at it more carefully. There are both positive and negative effects. And a lot of people go around saying, oh, Jupiter's nice, good fun. Jupiter can be an absolute bastard when it wants to be. Because Jupiter tends to make you go too far, you go overboard. Jupiter people are dogmatic. They talk too much and too loudly. I can't stand dogmatists. They really drive me crazy. They will not let me get my point across. And this is Jupiter. It takes you too far, too much. I remember a story told to me by my teacher about a fellow who was Jupiter ruled. He had Jupiter trining Venus, I think, in his chart, and he was about to experience a Jupiter trine Jupiter by transit, and he was waiting for every year he was going to make $1 million. He dropped dead. He had a heart attack. And a heart attack is often a symbol of somebody who is overdoing things. They're not allowing their body to take adequate rest. They're pushing themselves too far. And this Jupiter has got this not quite so nice side, which has always got to be remembered. You can go with Jupiter. I've got Jupiter opposition in mid-heaven at the moment. And I was reading up on that before I came over in Robert Hand's book as to what it said, and I loved it because he said, oh, the world will be wide open to you. He said, just watch it, you don't get too cocky. And this is very typical of Jupiter. And I mean, this is with Jupiter people too. They are cocky people. It's an act, but that doesn't matter. They are cocky people. Now, the most famous one, of course, the most notorious cycle is the Saturn cycle. Everybody thrives on the Saturn cycle. 28-year cycle, which is actually a 14-year cycle, which is actually a 7-year cycle, because here we start to bring in the squares as being very important. Saturn takes about 28 and a half years to get through the zodiac, which means that every 14 years it hits the opposition. In 7 years you have a square. So you've got 7 years between those squares. Boom, boom, boom. Now is there anybody here, just to make things a little bit easier, is there anybody here who before they came here didn't know what a Saturn return was? Good, great. Oh, you didn't. Well, a Saturn return is literally that when a Saturn comes back by transit to its place in the chart where it was when you were born. Okay, for instance, Saturn is what degree is Scorpio at the moment? 9 or something, isn't it? No, it's more than that, 15? About 15. So anybody who has 15 degrees of Scorpio, Saturn at 15 degrees of Scorpio in your natal chart, is experiencing a full Saturn return at the moment. My father in, and the class was interviewing him, and they said to him, what happened when you were 29? He said, oh, I thought it was time to settle down, so I got married. I thought, good heavens, there you've just uttered the definition of a Saturn return. Not the getting married bit, but that I thought it was time to settle down. And that's usually the mark of the Saturn return, the first one, not necessarily the second one. The Saturn return marks the time you decide, okay, it's time to do something concrete with my life. or your life, or whoever's life. So you do things which are going to give you some kind of a commitment, some kind of a purpose, something which is very real. So that's when careers start to really get going. It's also the time when those things that you started before the Saturn return, which were not real, in other words, they were just being done for the sake of experience, often Jupiterian experiences, that's the time they crumble. And this is why you get so many marriages going down the drain at 29. Because it wasn't a real experience. It was a Jupiter experience. It was to see what happens when you get married. And if you do it for that reason, at 29, it goes, because it's not real anymore. Of course, if you're Cancer like me, you hang on for another 4 years and hope it'll work itself out. Also, I think that the 14-year side, the 14-year and the 7-year side are very easily seen, particularly in the first Saturn return. Age 7 is when the child, it's the first Saturn square, okay, when you're 7 years old, Saturn comes around to square itself. And that's when a child first starts to release itself from its parents. Until it's 7 years old, it tends to be an offshoot of its parents. And in fact, up to that age, if you do the progressions of a child's chart, we were talking about this yesterday, you often see what's going on in the parent's life, not the child's life. Because until then, they're basically the offshoot of the child. It is the time, the first 7 years are that time of nurturing, the time of making sure that there is physical survival. And at 7, suddenly the child wakes up and says, hey, I don't agree with Mum. That's when it all starts.
I don't know about over in your country and that sort of thing, but over here, 7 is the age when they leave the infant, the joint large group tables and go and sit in an individual desk for the first time with a chair in a formal situation.
Yeah, right. I have noticed that life very nicely fits in. It seems as though we automatically recognise a lot of these things. We do it, we go to school at 5, but 7 is usually the time they go into the formal learning, when the first 2 years of kindergarten fun, and then it's about 7 where they really start to get going. 14 is even a bigger mark. 14 is the age of adolescence. And look at your kids' charts. Look at the Saturn opposition. That is when you start to have the teenage problems. Because when Saturn hits that opposition, suddenly they know, and they are right, I might add, not us, they are grown up. At least they're grown up to the point where they are now independent of their parents. In Israel, when you turn 14, you join the army if you're male. Here, the idea of a 14-year-old joining the army is, I can't do that, he's only a little boy. He is not a little boy, she is not a little girl. 14, again, it's happening earlier and earlier, but again, with a girl, 14 is generally the time where they start to ovulate, where they come to childbearing age. And again, in Eastern countries, particularly in olden times, the 14-year-old girls were married off. But in Western society, we have this thing about keeping our children, let them enjoy their childhood. I often think we do more damage to them by not allowing them to grow up in that way. At 14, this is when kids go out and start to get their first jobs. It's very interesting, this one. I've watched this a lot. My kids are now 17 and a half and almost 16, and I watched this very much with them. And it was right on that Saturn opposition where both of them said, I'm going to go and earn my own pocket money. Mainly because Mum didn't give them enough. But it doesn't matter. The motivation doesn't matter. The reasons behind things don't matter. The fact is that that was the time they felt they were mature enough to go and start supporting themselves. Again, a very Saturnian thing. They're taking on the maturity of learning to provide for themselves. At 21, which used to be, in Australia anyway, that was the age of voting, the age of adulthood. That's when you got the key to the door. It's now been lowered to 18. And I think they've made a mistake there because I think 21 is the correct one. 21 is when they do reach official adulthood, if you like. That is the next Saturn square, this one. Okay, it also coincides with the Iranian cycle, which we'll come into in a minute. If you look at this Saturn cycle from the point of view that 0 to 7 years is the time, as I said before, of mothers teaching, mothers nurturing, physical teaching, teaching them to take care of themselves in a physical way, to feed themselves, to bath themselves, and so on and so forth. 7 to 21 is the period of formal teaching, the period of school. That's when you go to school, that's when you go to university and so on, and you learn the formal education, the Jupiter-type education in terms of written stuff. No, third house education, not ninth, third. Then from 21 to 29 is the time when you go out and learn from the world. That's when you go out and you experience what the world teaches you. And in theory, at 29, you're supposed to have learned it all. At least you will have, the theory is that by the time you are 29, you have experienced everything you are ever going to experience. And between 29 and 56, you experience it all over again. Now, here's an interesting little trick for those of you that are over 29. Go back, take 29 years off your age, and have a think about what was happening to you at that time, and you'll find there's a direct connection between what was happening at that time and what is happening now. Because you are re-experiencing it. It's not exactly the same. I mean, if you, let's say, we were talking this morning, people losing their father. If you lost your father when you were 12, you're not going to lose your husband or whatever when you're 29 years older. But you will be re-experiencing something which is triggering the emotions that you got at the time when you lost your father. Something will be going on in your life that's bringing all that up. And this is how you can learn from the Saturn. This is how you use the Saturn cycle. Oh yeah, I've got here how interesting it is that number 7 is always regarded as such an important number in all the mystical sciences. Can you have a mystical science? In all the mystical areas, the number 7 seems to be a magic number. And it ties in astrology. Yeah, a lot of people. I mean, we have 7 days in the week even.
Yeah.
And 7 seems to have some magical properties for some reason. Now, as I say, haven't got into that area yet. It's on my list of must-do, all these things.
Yeah, Farlap was a 7.
Farlap was?
Yes.
What about Kiwi? Is he a 7? Because he's Farlap reincarnated. You realise that, don't you? I've got to think about Kiwi. Kiwi, for the people in the audience who don't know our Melbourne Cup. It's only you, Brian, I think.
Well, Farlap. Who's Farlap?
You don't know who Farlap. All right, we're going to digress totally. Farlap is the Australasian hero. Farlap was a racehorse. He was a racehorse who couldn't lose. And he was taken to America and he died under suspicious circumstances.
He was hushed up in the press, right?
But no, he was an incredible, he was a phenomenon. In fact, I always laugh, there is a show going on in the city at the moment called On the Wallaby, which is not a very good show, but one of the, hang on.
I think, no, Farlap, we're going back to it. Apparently his heart weighs 28 kilos.
28 kilos, yeah, there we go, there it is again. Yes, his heart is preserved in one museum and his body is stuffed in another museum in Australia. He was a phenomenal horse, and during the Depression, this show shows it beautifully. This all happened in the 30s. And this particular show shows this beautifully. During the Depression, where everybody's struggling to survive, and news came that Farlap had died in America, the whole nation went into mourning. They couldn't care less about the fact they didn't have enough food, but their beloved Farlap was dead. And this is typical. I'd say this is where New Zealand and Australia have something in common. that the horse is much bigger and more important than anything else.
When are you going to make a fantastic movie about it?
Farlap's there. When you're in Sydney, I'll take you to see it. That's a promise.
Okay. Because you make such fantastic films.
Yeah, no, we haven't. Is it?
It is on and all.
Any of you moon people go and see it, you will sob from beginning to end. You will love it. Yes, but it's happy. If you're Lunar, it doesn't matter whether it's sad, happy, angry, whatever, you cry. It's lovely. Take your tissues, you'll love it. You really will. All right, now where were we? Oh, and Kiwi. Kiwi is the New Zealand horse who went across to Australia for our Melbourne Cup, which is our Kentucky Derby. It's the big one. And he came in on Saturday. Nobody knew what he could do. He's a workhorse of all things, so they used him on the farm, and he ran away with the race. Did you all see it? It was brilliant. Marvellous. Oh, excellent race. And he's Starlap reincarnated. They're both New Zealand horses, but raced in Australia, you see. Now, Saturn return. Saturn's very serious. We should be very serious while we talk about Saturn. Where am I up to? Saturn, reality of experience. When I wrote Saturn as the reality of experience, I had no idea what I was talking about. Because I have since got that Saturn is the reality of the illusion and Neptune is the illusion of the reality. I've got that one. I'm not going to go into it here. I'll leave that to all you psychological people. But it's a very important one. Saturn is reality as we see it. And I think that this is why the Saturn returns are so very, very important, because it suddenly makes us face our version of reality. And we often don't like it. We often try to run away from it. Therefore, if a Saturn cycle is started on a note of reality, and I'm using, please put quotes every time I mention that word, if you start it on that reality, it can work extremely positively for you. Saturn can be the most positive planet in the zodiac, in the whole chart. It can really work for you if you let it, if you stop fighting it. I get so sick of people saying, oh, Saturn. Oh, incidentally, that actually brings in another point. All these things will work according to its nature in your chart. All right? Now, that means if you have a beautifully positive Saturn in your chart, the odds are you're never going to get too much junk from Saturn. I nearly said another word there. Which is a word often associated with Saturn and Pluto, more with Pluto probably. But if it's positive, if a planet is positive in your chart, you're not going to get too much trouble from it. I have seen people, including me, my Pluto's nothing. This is why I keep getting all the Scorpios. It doesn't do terribly much, but it's not afflicted, which is the important thing. And when I first started doing astrology, and I'd see all these big Pluto transits come up, and I'd, what's going to happen? With the Pluto transit, and nothing ever happened. Oh, well, I got divorced and things like that. But nothing important. But actually, no, that is important, because, divorce, again, is a very Plutonic thing. And I was divorced when Pluto crossed my ascendant.
Is this why in 21 a lot of young people commit suicide? It's a state of opposition.
No, it's more to do with the Uranus, I feel, if that is right. I haven't heard that before. It probably is a combination of both, I would say, the Saturn unreality and the Uranus wanting to do something really radical about it. And then we come down to it's the helping, isn't it, to do something. No, I wanted to mention this divorce business because actually it's a clear example of what I was talking about in relation to what I told you before about how as high as a kite and that happened. It was a Pluto conjunct ascendant, which is normally considered to be very heavy. And I suppose divorce can be heavy, except in my mind, I was divorced 3 years before when we split up. That's when it was heavy. The divorce was exactly, it did nothing. You walked in, the judge said, I pronounce you divorced, and you walked out. I was lucky, I had no hassles with kids and property and all that sort of thing. But the important thing is here that because Pluto is not afflicted in my chart, the ascendant did not have, the transit did not have a heavy effect on me. That's what I'm trying to get across. Had it been afflicted, probably I would have gone through the whole Cancer Taurus thing of rejection, and I'm not going to... Actually, I didn't let him go. I didn't let him go in here until it came to square my sun. And that's another story again. I don't think we'll get to that one. Now, I'll take an excuse here to try to have a bit of water. Right, that's where I was. I've forgotten where I was. So, if you start a Saturn cycle on a positive note, on a real note, then you will find that Saturn cycle will work extremely well for you because you're founding it on groundwork. Saturn to me is consolidation and groundwork. You know all that steel stuff they put under concrete slabs to stop all the concrete from falling through? That's the Saturn. It's the formwork that holds everything else up. And Saturn you don't see. When Saturn is working positively for you, you don't see any clear results. But everything you do from then on is based on something solid, or based on your idea of what is solid. Now, if you don't start that Saturn cycle on a positive note in that sense, on a real note, then when it comes to the square, you are going to be presented with a situation which is testing the base work of whatever it is that you started. And if the base work is too weak, it will founder. If it's strong, you won't even notice the square, it'll just go past. When you get to the opposition, you will complete the cycle, but if you have started that thing properly, you'll have no problems with completing the cycle. You just quietly complete it and go on with your life. If you have not started it on reality, you'll get to the opposition and suddenly the world will start caving in. And it will probably collapse. Now again, if you are a very fixed sign, or you're a very earthy sign, or the hanger-oners I'm talking about, you resist that, and you hang in there and you say, no, I'm not going to let it happen to me, it's not going to happen, I'm going to ride it out. Okay, you'll wait for another 14 years, it'll happen then, it'll happen. Unless it was based on something solid, you've just drawn out the torture a bit longer, that's all. Now, yeah.
So getting away from naturalist, I think it also works on a marriage chart. You know, 7 years.
Oh yes, 7 year itch.
You're close to break
I find it's 9 in my life.
Yeah. And the towels are sort of getting frayed, you know, and the sheets filling up.
Not to mention the relationship itself. Now this is an interesting one because a lot of relationships, and again, as Brian was mentioning this morning, and Robert last night, to most modern astrologers, marriage means nothing but a partnership or a shared relationship. It does not mean a piece of paper. But I use the word marriage because it describes the sort of relationship I'm talking about. And you often find that a lot of relationships start, so many of them start, on Saturn, and this brings in the other bit about the Saturn cycles with the other planets. The number of them that start on Saturn-Venus cycles is unbelievable. I think you're crazy. But anyway, you do tend to start a relationship very often on a Saturn cycle because Saturn is commitment, and of course this is what we're all asking for in a relationship. Whether we like to think we are or not, I believe we all are asking for that commitment. And what many of us do is that 7 years, 14 years, in some cases 28 years later, that relationship goes. But what do? We jump into exactly the same relationship with another man or another woman, and it's exactly the same one we've just finished. And we think, aren't we good? If we're astrologers, we think that's terrific. We've done the Saturn bit, we've changed. You know, we've gone on to something new, but we haven't. All we've done is swap men or swap women. Do you want to try to say something there?
No, I was just nodding. I was really
I mean, I'm a past master at that, right from my father right through. Every man in my life has been Scorpio. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Trying to think how many there've been. But it goes back to, I keep going back to that. I think, right, I've cleared that one up, I've done it, and I worked this out because I realised that I went back to the serious ones before I started astrology, and my husband was a double Scorpio. My father is a Scorpio. And I realised...
So it didn't affect you?
Well, it affects me in that way. The transits don't affect me within me. Where it affects me is I'm projecting my Pluto onto every man I meet. Even the guys before that, in my teenage years, one was a Leo with Sun conjunct Pluto, the other was an Aquarius with Sun opposition Pluto. So I could keep getting them in there somewhere. I won't, we'll leave that one, I think. I'm working through that. All right. Now, the thing is with Saturn, as with Jupiter, but even more importantly with Saturn, even more importantly with the other, is that you've got to also watch the Saturn cycles on the other planets. There's my New Zealand accent again. Saturn with Venus is forming a relationship cycle. Saturn with Jupiter is a work cycle, a business cycle. Right? Saturn with Uranus is a very interesting one. Are there any other Saturn-Uranus conjunctions here? Try. You know the conjunction, it's the generation I'm looking at. That's a very interesting one because we are perpetually walking around trying to balance reality with what we know is not reality. So it's a very interesting that one. And we are now, of course, going through that, starting that cycle all over again. But all we are, Saturn Sun is a coming to terms with the animus, as we were talking about before. Saturn moon, again, is the coming to terms with the anima, and you will create situations for yourself where you are going to work through this cycle. In simpler terms, if you like, the Saturn sun, and I don't think anybody has come up with a really good keyword for the sun. I'm waiting for someone to give me that keyword where I go, that's it. I still think the closest one, although it doesn't mean it, is the ego, the vital ego. So Saturn sun, when you start a Saturn sun cycle, you are starting a cycle of looking for yourself. You are trying to then, for the next 14, 28 years, you are on a search for who am I in here. Saturn moon, you're doing it with the emotional thing. And this comes back to the animus anima thing because, of course, these are both directly related to mummy daddy. It comes back to that. All right, I think we can leave Saturn. Let's go on to Uranus. Oh, one more thing. Saturn takes 2.5 years to go through a house, and believe me, you know what house Saturn is going through. Because when Saturn goes through a house, you have to sort it out. You have to bring it back. You have to take responsibility for it. And that is the key word for Saturn, is responsibility. And if you come to terms with responsibility, which incidentally, seeing I've noticed that everybody here is very keen on breaking down words for their true meanings, responsibility is response. The ability to respond to. It is not a heavy trip. We've been taught that it's a heavy trip. Our parents tell us we should be responsible children. Our spiritual leaders say we should be responsible in relationships and so on. And we should. We should respond to them. And that's what Saturn is. The reality is the ability to respond to any given situation. Okay? And when Saturn goes through a house, you will then respond to the situations as represented by that house. Now we're going for time. Oh my God. Quickly. Uranus. Now we come to the biggies. Uranus is a very important one, I feel. I think Uranus is my favourite planet. At least it was till it started to go into Sag. Could leave me alone for a while, I'd be very happy. Now, with Uranus, the squares are extremely important. The full Uranus cycle is 84 years, which is pretty well man's span of life. I heard an interesting thing. My father's very heavy Scorpio, and I was teasing him the other day about getting old. He's 76, and he said to me, "Oh no, I'll die when I'm 82." Dead serious. Now, he's going to die when he's 82. I'm glad he told me that. At least I know exactly when it's going to happen. But I'm watching, because I don't think it'll be 82. I think it'll be 84. I think it'll be right on that Uranus conjunction. And this is, and these days particularly, this is the average lifespan. Now, it takes 7 years, 7 again, to go through the sign and the house. And I think we all are able to experience Uranus going through a house or through a sign, because we become, to me, the key word that most symbolises, for me, Uranian energies is awareness. Uranus makes you aware. Not always kindly, but it makes you aware. This is why he acts like a lightning bolt, because you need a shock to become aware. Otherwise you get complacent, you get stagnant. Now, whenever Uranus hits a sensitive point or any point, he causes disruption in order to make you wake up and say, oh, right, look what's happening. Now, I have found that Uranus never, ever closes a door without opening another one. Never. He makes you look at other opportunities which previously you never considered. There is always something positive to be taken up with an awareness, with a Uranus transit. Now, again, we have those important years. At 14, we have, 21, we get the first square. Is that right? Yes. 21, we get the square, and at 42, we get the opposition, which means that at 64, we get the next square. 63, 64.
Nowadays, the Uranus and Gemini people are getting that much earlier. They're getting it about.
Yeah, I was just coming to that. That was my next one. At the moment, there was a period, and this is just when I was born, Uranus moved very, very rapidly. In late 1942, early 1943, it moved extremely fast, with the result that the people born about that time are now getting their Uranus opposition, or as Carol put it earlier, I call it Uranus return, it's just as easy. And it is pretty well, because that is when you first notice it. They're getting it around 37, 38, happening very early. In fact, I had a situation where people who were a year younger than I were experiencing their Uranus opposition before I did, which was quite interesting. Now, with Uranus, when Uranus hits a planet in your chart, you must break the habits that go with that planet. For instance, Uranus hitting Venus, I've got Uranus opposition Venus at the moment, you must break the habit that you have, the complacency that you have formed about relationship. In other words, if you have got stuck in a rut, you're repeating a pattern over and over again, you will have to break it. And Uranus will give you situations which are going to force you to break it, which is why Uranus-Venus is notorious for bringing very exciting, very temporary love affairs. So watch these inner planets. When Uranus hits them, the personal planets, watch what you are being habitual about at that time. Okay, and that's what's got to break. Now, Uranus, this is the 21 years. This is where I think you get the suicide thing. And this is why I think you get so much rebellion at 21, when kids turn 21, because they get that Uranus square. It makes them aware of the world outside. It makes them aware of themselves. And we get a lot of the big, what do you call them, alternative lifestyle things. People who are generally rebelling against society, this is the age when they start to do that.
We had 2 young 14-year-olds in the Hexham area who were suicide. 14.
Right, exactly. That's Uranus going to an extreme. Now, we also have a situation with that, and this is another lecture again, of the great Uranus-Pluto conjunction with all the kids born in the 60s. And I would love to sit with some people one day and really just, you know, while we're here, and discuss this, because I feel it is a very important conjunction. And that's what you're getting now. You're getting this, these people coming back. All right, now, Neptune and Pluto, actually, we don't have to talk about so quickly because they can never complete a full circuit. But what is important with Neptune is that around 41s it forms a square to itself. Okay? It can't form the opposition, or it forms an opposition around about 80 years old. Now, Neptune dissolves, all right? It draws the person out of the self to become aware of the larger social order. All that Saturnian reality that you looked at before, all of a sudden you look at it and you think, ugh, that's not really real at all. And off you go onto a whole new track. But with Neptune going through the houses, particularly if it's following Saturn, you will find that Neptune will dissolve that Saturnian reality. It will switch things completely around. At the moment, Saturn is following Neptune, but we're going to very soon have that situation where one follows the other. But it is the ability to understand spirituality. I don't think it's necessarily spirituality itself. It gives the ability to understand what it's about. And then you go from there, whether you need to get it or not. So you can get that on the positive side, or on the negative side, of course, which is the way it usually works with me, is utter confusion and chaos, and disappointment, and even more importantly, disillusionment. Neptune takes away illusion as well as giving it. And this is when we get disappointed and deception under Neptune. We are being disillusioned. And I think that's a side of Neptune people don't often look at. I find that where natal Neptune gives illusory factors, then with progressed or transiting Neptune mainly, you start to get the disillusory factors. It works in a disillusioning way rather than illusioning way. Also, you always get with the Neptune, especially the Neptune square to itself, I think everybody gets blocked drains. They happen all the time. Now, of course, the thing, note, that square is the early 40s. And you can find, what I'm building up to, of course, is what the psychologists call the mid-career crisis, or the midlife crisis, or we had the housewife syndrome. I love that. Men had career crises, we had the housewife syndrome. Now, what you're getting here, and I'll be very quick here because I know it's getting very, very late. Actually, I have got another 3 minutes. During that age group, between 40 to 45, you have by solar arc every planet semi-squaring itself, setting off the natal chart. You have the progress moon opposing itself. You have transiting Jupiter opposing itself, transiting Saturn opposing itself, transiting Uranus opposing itself, transiting Neptune squaring itself, and transiting Pluto squaring itself. Is it any wonder? Well, what happens is we get to this age and we suddenly think, what is it all about? What was it all for? The whole thing seems meaningless. And this is when you get executives running off to Tahiti with their secretaries, women walking out on, mousy little women suddenly walking out on their husband and 6 kids. It's a very big time. It usually begins with the Uranus opposition, which is bringing about the conditions or the circumstances which are going to disrupt the existing conditions. It finishes with the Pluto square. Now that, I might add, is only in recent years. Up until recently, the Pluto square didn't occur until the second Saturn return at 56. But again, because Pluto moved through Leo fairly quickly and Cancer fairly quickly, it's come down earlier. Now, what I have found, and I'd like you all to watch this, is that people who are very fixed, and you get this a lot with men too, and I'm not saying this I'm not being feministic, but men, because of their conditioning, this is along the lines of what we were talking about before, men, because of their conditioning, and fixed people, earthy people, they resist that Uranus opposition. With the result that very often on a physical plane, you don't see anything. You can't see anything in the outside world that's happening, but it's all happening in here. And what happens is they resist it, and along comes that Pluto square, and bang, everything blows up. Whereas very mutable people, watery people, air people, most women, they start immediately with that Uranus opposition, and they feel it, and they go with it, and because of that, they handle it over that 5-year period, so that Pluto square Pluto, although we were talking earlier today, it looks as if that Pluto square Pluto signifies menopause very often, or the psychological conditions of menopause. They seem to handle that mid-career thing just that little bit better overall. But I think this is a great deal to do with conditioning, and we're going to see a lot of changes. Look, I could go on and on. Look, I could go on and on, but I do think we ought to leave it there. I would be very happy to continue this in a workshop situation at some stage. I like to talk about things, not talk to you about things. So, I love to discuss them. So if anybody would like to, please just let me know. And I think we'd better leave it there before I get lynched. I can see everybody looking in the doors. So thanks very much.